The colossal site of Karnak, Egypt is one of the largest temple complexes in the world, with an incredible architectural, ritual, religious, economic, social, and political richness. This complex, which contains several temples, is situated on the right bank of the Nile to the north of the city of Luxor and spans over 2 square kilometers. The temples are grouped into 3 main enclosure walls and are recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. Today, Karnak is a tourist destination and since 1967, an excavation site for the Franco-Egyptian Center of Temple Studies in Karnak. Karnak is a dynastic temple constructed over many years. Every pharaoh wished to contribute a new stone, which is why this monument lacks a completely uniform design. With that said, the temples from the Ptolemaic period differ from those from Edfu, Dendera, and Komombo, which are very uniform. These temples were constructed using a method that was very efficient for the time. The process started with an original plan and ended quickly with a completed monument. On the other hand, throughout Egyptian history, Karnak has undergone additions, deconstructions, endless modifications. The construction of the Karnak complex spanned over more than 2 millennia with a series of large construction projects, modifications, additions, deconstructions, reorganizations, which made it the most expansive religious center in ancient Egypt. The main temple, dedicated to the god Amon-Re, is oriented along an east-west axis perpendicular to the Nile, which it was once connected to by a canal and an artificial basin. The harbor served to bring barks and tugboats to shore for the large annual ceremonies along the Nile. The dock platform continues on to the Dromos, a processional aisle, surrounded by cryosphinxes. Held between their paws are statuettes that once held the names of Thutmose IV and Amenhotep II until Ramses II replaced their names for his own. The rulers of Karnak, or pharaohs, have the power to completely destroy and replace monuments. Throughout the new empire, this is exactly what happened. In the Ramesside period, there are slightly different practices to the extent that instead of rebuilding the monument entirely, they effaced the name of the old pharaoh and put in its place the name of the new sovereign. This is architectural politics at its cheapest, since only the royal cartouches had to be changed. This is also done for certain edifices during the new empire. The cryosphinx, or cryocephalic sphinx, is characterized by a body of a crouching or resting lion and a head of a ram with curved horns. It alludes to the god Re and symbolizes at once physical power and fertile vigor. The animal is an exceptional being that brings together the strength of the lion and the passion of the ram. Thus, this worship of vitality has made Karnak a destination for numerous pilgrimages, which have also left their mark. This is an Egyptological study that also takes into account the graffiti on the columns left behind by visitors. The placement of the graffiti indicates the burial level of the temples for the periods during which travelers could visit the temple. In order to get through the exterior wall, you must first pass the first pylon, which is 15 meters thick at its base and 43 meters high. We are now in the first court of the Amon-Re Temple, which is situated between the first and second pylon. It is the vastest court of the entire temple. Within it, there's a large colonnade. Only one column from the reign of Taharqa of the 25th dynasty remains. It was reassembled by the French mission many years ago. On the lateral walls and columns, we can see the burial levels of the temple from the 19th century, before the first major excavations of this era were carried out. In this court, the projects of the Franco-Egyptian Center of the 1960s and 70s brought in an excavation floor to the lower circulation level before the pedestrian pavement was replaced. This allows us to observe the numerous ways in which the pavement was used in relation to earlier edifices. This project was carried out at the beginning of the 20th century, after the reassembly of the huge column of Taharqa. In a place where space and time multiply, archaeology has much to do to dismantle the imbroglio that is the reuse of the stone from ancient monuments into more recent constructions. In addition, the court, which was created in a later period, was emptied of most of its statues and ex voto, which had been collecting there over many centuries. Here and there, the remains of a pavilion, 2 small temples, a court, and older monuments all await an eventual restoration or reconstruction. Of all the buildings that made up the court, only a beautifully restored triple chapel altar, constructed for the ships of Amon-Re, Mut, and Khonsu, remains. The chapel altar was constructed towards the end of the 12th century by Ramses II's grandson, Seti II. During this time period, it was found in the forecourt by the second pylon. Some 10 days out of every year, the god Amon, who resided in the Karnak temple, would return to the Luxor temple for the Opet festival. In order to undertake his journey, the divinity was placed inside the barks brought over by the priests. The Opet was the country's most important religious festival and attracted a considerable crowd. But in order to understand the story, one must know how to read the markings and reconstruct the ruins. The majority of the Karnak temple and annex structures are made of sandstone, which is a very unstable material that turns quickly back into sand. Therefore, deciphering Karnak and all the Egyptian sites constructed in this material becomes more complicated. Sandstone deteriorates fairly easily. There are certain chemical products which restore cohesion to the material. The process of preserving these blocks is equally important as returning them to their proper place. Once these blocks have been identified, localized, and restored, the reconstruction work begins. The Temple of Ramses III, like that of Seti II, was constructed well before that last great wall of Karnak. Thus, during this time, it was outside the religious complex. Today, the entrance pylon, flanked by 2 royal idols, stands at the heart of the large court. On its facade, we see a depiction of the king's massacre of the conquered people, as well as an illustration of the god Amon, to whom the temple is consecrated. The building contains a court. It is surrounded on 3 sides by a peristyle, which is decorated by 16 statues of the pharaoh. The Temple of Ramses III also has a vestibule supported by 4 columns, a hypostyle room of 8 columns, and 3 chapels which were intended to receive the sacred boats of the Amon, Mut, and Khonsu triad. Once the reconstruction is finished, archaeologists, with the help of the scriptures on the walls, can start to formulate an idea of how daily life proceeded in these once sacred places. To the back of the great forecourt stands the second pylon. It is about 100 meters long, and its height almost reaches 30 meters. Commissioned by Horemheb around 1300 BC with blocks taken from a structure of Akhenaton, the second pylon was completed by Ramses II. The ornamentation was completed under Ramses III. It was restored and glorified 1,000 years later during the Ptolemaic period. The second pylon precedes a large hall before which stand colossal rose granite statues, one of which was usurped by Pinigem, a great priest turned pharaoh. However, it is generally agreed that they date from the era of Ramses II when the temple was at its peak. The statue to the left is 15 meters tall and possesses at its feet an ever so small statue depicting the wife or daughter of the pharaoh. Scientific research is a legion of false leads and enigmas. The first task, as we can see, is to restore the edifices so that we can understand these places. But sometimes the sandstone blocks are scattered. In order to reattribute meaning to all these mysteries, we need to collect them somewhere. The replacing of the maximum number of stones in situ or not is called anastylosis. Once the study of the stone monuments has been confirmed by Egyptological and architectural research, the stones are reassembled. That is, if there are enough. Anastylosis is carried out in the open-air museum, which is uniquely intended for this type of reconstruction. This technique rebuilds what has been completely destroyed while preserving the stones at the same time. The stones keep much better when they are reused in the constructions rather than left outside under benches. After, it becomes a question of whether the number of remaining stones is an issue or not. The convention states that if we have a stone and we know its position within the temple, if it is technically feasible, we put it systematically back in its place. The off-site reconstructions allow historians to improve their historical understanding, notably thanks to the scriptures on the stones. We are inside the open-air museum. It is positioned along the northwest axis of the Great Wall of Karnak. This space is dedicated to the reassembly and restoration of monuments. These blocks here come from several structures. They come from Thutmose II, Thutmose III. They might be already analyzed or in the process of being analyzed. Perhaps they will result in a restoration. Here we have taken out all the blocks that we need. Today, almost 80% were already reassembled. If the monument permits and we have a sufficient number of blocks, we propose a full-scale approval of these Egyptological restorations. What we have here is a limestone monument, a structure from Thutmose II and Hatshepsut that is in the process of being reassembled according to Egyptological research. We find ourselves here in front of the first wall that was built. We have chosen to construct this one first because it is the only one that has the first base block and starting stone height. For the rest of the walls, we're missing the first meter. In order to have the exact height of the edifice, we must begin with the only wall of which we have the full height. The work is very precise. When fixing the altitude of a block, we must measure to the millimeter. Our original plans didn't give us this kind of precision. Therefore, it is our job to precisely define all the architectural elements before construction so that we know where we are going to put everything. We began by putting up this wall since we have its total height. There's a single block on top that is a lacunar. We have a photo of it that was taken when it was completed at the beginning of the century. After a century of alterations, only this little bit remains. With a ratio, we can determine fairly accurately the height of this block, and therefore the height of the entire structure up to the ceiling. With this height, we can then determine the altitude of the first block for all the other walls, and ultimately find the exact altitude of the structure. Over time, the puzzle takes shape. This building was taken down and its blocks were released. They were even cut up in order to be reused in other structures. Even during antiquity, they were stored in various locations. All this leads to the discrepancies in the block's degradation. For example, the one on the left still has crusts of salt and dust on it. Its state of preservation is very different from that of a block right next to it. If they stayed out in the same position, there wouldn't be these differences. It is because they are reused and then stocked in different places that they are subjected to completely different forms of degradation. Once the blocks are placed, the restorers will come and verify the state of all the blocks. We're going to take a look at another construction project that is stopped for the moment. The walls of the chapel have been constructed. The slabs, whose blocks were collected from 300 meters behind us and dragged here by truck, still need to be put in place. This is a large block of limestone which weighs about 45 tons. There are still some fragments left to glue. We can see them in front of us there. The collection of fragments has to be readjusted and glued to this enormous slab before we can put it on top of the edifice. We are just in front of the chapel in order to show you where the slabs will be placed. The large block should weigh, after it is entirely glued together, around 60 tons. It will go above the wooden beams that we have here. Those there are the buttresses that prevent the chapel from shifting during breaks. After a precise adjustment of its location, the large linted block will be placed into the socket, which is just over there. The difficult part of assembling these fragments will be the intricacy of the side of contact, which is extremely rough with many nooks. It will be very difficult to adjust them. The technique we will use implements gravity in order to find the proper means of assembly. Now, when the face is vertical, we cannot implement gravity. We are going to have to raise the block and put it in the trench so that the side of contact is horizontal. There, with our crane, we will be able to bring together each fragment and, using its own gravitational weight, find its position. Once accurately measured, we will be able to bring the lower block, the lintel block, which only weighs around 20 tons, and place it in back. The most majestic part of the Amon Temple is the Hypostyle hall situated between the second and third pylon. Composed of 134 monumental columns, it evokes an enormous thicket of stone papyrus. Originally enclosed by a ceiling, light filters in through the lattice windows, some of which are still in place. The columns, the majority of which are still standing, have kept their ornamentation. A real gold mine for historical researchers. There we find the great Hypostyle Hall of Karnak, the most representational and recognized monument of the Karnak complex. The building was constructed in several stages. Recent research projects have led to a precise conclusion regarding the chronology of its construction and ornamentation. The chronology of the installation of a hypostyle hall like this one is much more complex than one would imagine for the time period. These construction projects were spread out between the 15th and the 13th century BC. Architectural and epigraphic research is being carried out in this great hall. This is partnered with a 3D digitization process, which was put into effect several years ago. It is performed on the entire hypostyle hall in order to obtain views of the column. One photo per column is to be used to serve the epigraphic study. We realize that the epigraphic convention, that is to say, putting your nose to the wall and working in the traditional fashion, is irreplaceable. But this new technology allows us to bring new tools to the study. Epigraphy is a study of inscriptions made on materials like stone or clay. The science works to date the inscriptions in order to place them within their cultural context, as well as translate them and deduce the essential information that can be extracted. Today, numeric epigraphy is an essential tool in modern archaeology. The epigraphic analysis of the perimeters and the exterior walls of the Hypostyle Hall has already been put into effect by the University of Chicago, who started several years ago and still continue to work on this project. For several years, the University of Memphis, Tennessee has been using the 3D scan technique on the epigraphic analysis of the columns. In this hypostyle hall, distinct phases of construction and decoration have taken place. In the Ramesside period, there are instances where certain pharaohs efface and replace the names of their predecessors. We have palimpsest texts that subtly mention this. Only the eye of the epigraphist can discern and distinguish these phases of decoration. The columns, perfectly aligned along the axis of the enormous hall, 103 meters in length and 53 meters wide, are about 23 meters tall. They grow in circumference from 10 meters to 15 meters, where the capital widens. The lateral nave supports measure 15 meters in height, with a circumference of about 8 meters. In other words, writing materials. On these columns, the sagas and exploits of pharaohs are recounted. Engraved in the stone, they are in our reach, given that we manage to understand them. Amon is the main god of Karnak. At first, it was a provincial god, but later it appeared in a very important way in the Egyptian pantheon at the start of the Middle Empire. When the rulers of the 11th and 12th dynasty took power of Thebes, they made this local god national and dynastic. It took its place in the pantheon, appropriating theologies and attributes of various, mainly Heliopolitan, divinities. The sun cult, popular during ancient Egypt, is led by Amon, the god of Thebes and one of the main divinities of the Egyptian pantheon. His name, which means the hidden or unknowable, conveys the impossibility of knowing his true form. He appears under numerous guises. Amon became a national divinity since he is the unifier of Egypt. It is said that gods bow at his feet like dogs when they recognize the presence of their master. So it is here in Karnak where the priests of Egyptian temples sustain the worship to this divinity. The worship of the god Amon. Egyptian temples were not churches. They were places where believers could haunt and visit a god. During certain days on the liturgical annual calendar, gods left in procession to be visible to humans. There are two important festivals that are tied to the god Amon of Karnak. First, there's the Festival of the Valley, where the god Amon appears on the west bank of Thebes and visits funeral sites. Second, the Opet Festival, when Amon visits the Luxor Temple, which is considered the southern harem connected to the Karnak Temple. At the peak of his following, Amon is associated with Re, the sun god, becoming the cosmic god Amon-Re, the eternal, the lord of Karnak, creator of all that exists, master of everything, and who is established in all things. Some legends say that he fertilized the cosmos with his semen. He has blue skin because his flesh is composed of lapis lazuli, the ultimate magic stone. Priests were in charge of worshipping this god according to a very rigid hierarchy, with the great priest at the top. He was the only one who could take the pharaoh's place and was allowed to open the god's naos, dress it, and give him offerings. Then, beneath this great priest, there was a series of others, each with their own very specific tasks, until the modern priest at the bottom, who is in charge of bringing the offerings and maintaining the god's domain. The space, the Amon Temple Square, which extends above the third portal, was constructed under Thutmose I and II, along with a monumental pylon, the fourth portal, and 2 pairs of obelisks. The still-standing obelisk, the work of Thutmose I, is an immense piece of monolithic granite, with a height of 22 meters and a weight of around 140 tons. Other monoliths were broken down in order to be transferred to important places within the Roman Empire, or were broken by earthquakes. The Amon-Re chapel altar, constructed during the Greek era and finished during the 4th century BC, replaced an identical rose granite edifice that must have been significantly ruined. The boat chapel is very simple. It opens on a divine axis at its 2 ends so as to create an open space for movement and travel. The entrance is located at the Great West Door. The bark bearers come in through the vestibule. There can be up to 32 bearers, 16 on each side of the bark. The offerings to Amon, which are depicted on the walls, are the subject of a new epigraphic study on Karnak during the Greco-Roman era. This chapel altar dates back to the reign of Philip Aridios, the half-brother of Alexander the Great. It is an historically recent monument, even for Karnak, that dates from the 4th century BC. Like Alexander the Great and his successors, Philip Aridios was a Ptolemaist and treated like a full-fledged pharaoh. Priests appearing in the scenes of this monument, making offerings to the gods, represented Philip Aridios in the same way as they would ancient pharaohs, such as Thutmose III or Ramses II. To the left, we recognize Amon in his crown, topped with 2 high feathers. On this granite monument, we are currently performing epigraphic readings of the set of walls, the texts, inscriptions, and decorations, in preparation for a publication on these monuments. The scenes etched in this first room represent a whole series of offerings made by the pharaoh Philippe Aridios to the god Amon. We have several types of offering scenes, Amon being the main god of Karnak. This building is where the bark was kept. These offering scenes were performed in front of the gods. To complete the set of facsimiles for this wall in the first hall, it takes about 1 month, with 2 or 3 epigraphists working full days. For the wall, we carry out reproductions and readings at scale 1 on the plastic film. We take into account all that we have on this plastic film. We note the inscriptions, the decorations, the ruptures. The plastic film is then digitally photographed on an illuminated table, and the drawings are digitally transmitted onto the computer, where all the copies of the monument can be stored. Inside the Great Walls of Amon, there's the main temple, which was dedicated to Amon-Re. It is situated along an east-west axis. All around in this enclosure, there are other minor monuments, somewhat important temples, and minor chapels, which are associated with a series of divinities. There's Khonsu, the son of the Amun triad, and his wife Mut to the south. There also is the Opet Temple, which is an Assyrian sanctuary. There's also an entire set of chapels devoted to the cult of Osiris, which trace back to the 1st century BC. They're scattered all over the northeastern section of the Karnak Temple. Also to the north, we have the Ptah Temple, which used to be located outside of the Great Walls of Amon, where it was first constructed during the 18th dynasty. Then, during the 30th dynasty, it was subsequently inserted into the Great Walls. The Ptah Temple is separate from Karnak. Along the way, other crews try to reattribute meaning to the seeming chaos, which is teeming with information. The study of the eroded blocks that scatter the Karnak site takes a long time. Each section is analyzed according to the given issues from such and such time period. We are now in front of the Ptah Temple, which is located to the north of the Great Amon Temple, on the border of the brick enclosure wall that you see behind it, which dates to the 30th dynasty. The temple itself was constructed during the New Empire under Thutmose III. During this era, it was outside the enclosure wall. It was later included during the 30th dynasty. We almost have a complete understanding of this temple, a project which began October 2008. The goal of the project is to publish the hieroglyphic texts, a complete architectural study, and a full photographic record. At the same time, we are excavating the monument and the remains which are located to the south and on the western border of the structure. In Egyptian mythology, Ptah, the creator, is the god of artisans and architects. During the Middle Empire, he's one of the 5 great Egyptian gods, along with Re, Amon, Isis, and Osiris. In this project framework, we have a diverse, multidisciplinary crew, including topographic architects, which you can see now in the construction site. They restore the remains found during excavations. We also have archaeologists who are now in the trenches, and restorers who are currently working inside the prior mentioned temples. The Ptah Temple, separated from the main Amon sanctuary, was never subjected to a true reading and restoration. All of this is to be performed during this mission. We can begin to put together the pieces. You have to imagine we have a temple that is the stone epicenter. All around it are shops and enclosure walls which are being built, one after another, slightly modeled after the Karnak temple with its great enclosure walls. However, before these previous enclosure walls were built, we recognized that there was a much more restricted space. At the same time, we are working and excavating on a horizontal plane in order to incorporate the efficient use of space. We are creating surveys in order to have a chronological sequence which allows us to see how the periods connect, or if we have gaps in the succession. The ceramic is an extremely important element because there are particular styles which are specific to certain periods. This allows us to identify the layers of use. We often end up with a very limited background. As you see here, we have a very tiny space for ovens. This is certainly a domestic job, excavated on several levels. You have a level of ovens at the bottom. You have some sideboards there as well. We welcome students who already have their masters. We also have a team of Egyptian workers who are customarily used in this temple. Outside of the great axis of the Amon domain, and like all the structures on the periphery, the Ptah Temple has never been the subject of recent studies. This location doesn't receive the same level of endorsement as the Amon Temple. Therefore, it is interesting on the one hand because the building is human-sized. On the other hand, from chronological standpoint, although it was constructed under Thutmose III, the latest decorations of the text date back to the reign of Tiber, thus the Roman era. This human-sized temple has a condensed history, which allows us to complete a study in a relatively short amount of time. We have the monolithic building of Thutmose III, first construction. We then have, facing me, a door of Chabaka, which connects to an enclosure wall, certainly an embellishment to the project. The second door of Chabaka is located a bit farther. We have a small monument by itself in the middle. The second door is just after, to the left of the palm tree. We see that there are typological changes with the lateral entrances. We can prove that this monument had a covered courtyard under Thutmose III. We have a beautiful work of restoration. After we change the image a little of what exists of the temple. We have to also take into consideration that its entire environment has changed, notably because of the Great Wall of the Amon Temple used to be much smaller. Originally, the temple was outside of the Amon complex. We know that the temple was the last stop. When the gods leave to visit Luxor or other places, we know that the procession comes back to this temple in Karnak. It is the last stop. During the era when Thutmose III constructed it, this is an extramuros temple, which will later become an intramuros temple with the Nectanebo's construction of the Great Wall. On the other side, a bit farther, there's a complex called North Karnak. This religious complex contains a temenos. However, this temple saw its temenos and domain reduced as a result of the construction of the Great Wall that came to border the north side of the temple. A piece of the alterations made by the Ptolemies can be explained with a small lateral door, which we see here. There used to be a lateral door on the other side during the reign of Thutmose III. However, with the construction of the Great Wall, it was blocked from being further used. Just below, we also see stone levels and doors clearly demarcating an axis, which is perhaps related to the monument seen over there. They are also in the middle of being excavated. There's a section that is less understood. It is in the process of being better deciphered from a topographical, geographical, and historical standpoint. The temple is a very exclusive place to give worship to a god or a statue of a god, but this worship is not carried out by everyone. It is carried out by a priest who is the representative of the pharaoh. Ultimately, only a divine being can give worship. It is not something that's open to the public. Contrary to this beautiful view that the Egyptian temples offer, this is not a central meeting space. Instead, there is motion, with a series of doors that isolate it from the outside. For daily worship, we can see that there are a series of lateral entrances. This is not at all a vista, nor a space that was visited by the public. We are here in the forecourt of the Ptah Temple, linked to the door of Ptolemy VI. We have a view of the entire series of doors which embellish this sanctuary. They were constructed by the sovereigns and were most certainly restored. In the background, we have a door which still opens into the main room, which leads to the chapels of the Ptah Temple. We approach the holier, since behind me is a room which leads to two chapels. There we have in the courtyard the original project of Thutmose III, which was covered by the Ptolemies, evidenced by the fact that covering blocks were found in this space. There's an observable rise in the altitude, a very particular cliff, and above there's a Ptolemaic increase in elevation with a window, a perfect cutout. And if we discern carefully, we even see a groove, and it is clear that there was once a screen wall. These records are accompanied by an architectural study that allows us to define the history of the monuments along with their numerous reconstructions. We can restore the others. There's one on the angle and one on the axis. We're succeeding in restoring the roof, also by using blocks found outside and restored columns. A comprehensive study of the temple has therefore been undertaken. It will permit us to present an epigraphic series covering a large portion of Karnak's history. If we go back to Thutmose III, it is interesting to see that he used a lot of blocks from older buildings. This happened very often because an Egyptian religious sculpture is sacred, even if it is no longer useful. Very often we find in the base, or within the structure, elements that were reused from ancient buildings. There we had the surprise of finding, both in the chapels and the courtyard, the large white limestone floors that came from an older structure. We see that there are elements which we can clearly identify as cornetto cornice, which I'm in the middle of cleaning. We can classify them under the palmette motif. For the moment, we have a good 10 or so blocks which allow us to imagine a building of a certain stature. We also have on the other side, at the base level, two areas which reuse the lime and sandstone blocks from Hatshepsut and from Thutmose III as well. You can see that it's had a very short life. We see that the reuse of blocks in large work of latter buildings is a true conundrum for architect-archaeologists. As we have seen, we must clean the remaining parts and also account for the parts that are missing. A project foresees having to even copy the statues borrowed by Western museums so as to return them to their environmental origins. Now we're entering into the axial room, which is dedicated to Amon. It's divided into two chapels, to the north the Ptah Chapel, and to the south a chapel dedicated to Thoth, which was partially destroyed. In the north we're lucky to have the whole structure, which is not the case here. We don't have the ceiling here. In this chapel, the structure has been dismantled up to mid-height. This chapel is special. Our predecessors have found that this second statue wasn't originally here. We know that it came from the Temple of Amon-Re III. We already know of statue migrations and religious elements of antiquity. It was reconstructed here in situ, which brings very few visits to the temple. In fact, there's a mystical tourism with people who come to pray to this statue because it supposedly contains a lot of energy. We leave the Ptah Temple for the festival hall of Thutmose III, which continues along the central axis towards the east. Behind the main sanctuary of Amon, Thutmose III built the Akhmenu, said festival temple. This ceremony of the pharaoh's rebirth took place after 30 years of a pharaoh's reign and reoccurred every 30 years. To the left, a superb festival hall, 40 meters in length, the nave is demarcated by 10 columns shaped like tent stakes. The ceiling was painted blue, scattered with yellow stars. Around the nave, the basilica edifice is made of aisles which lead to a series of lateral halls. Two of them, called the Botanical Room, are particularly remarkable for their decoration, like a catalogue inspired by the flora and fauna of the king's conquered kingdom. The north-south axis from the central Temple of the Karnak site starts with a courtyard that faces the set Pylon. In 1902, the French Egyptologist Georges Legrand discovered a collection of very valuable statues which were hidden in the soil of this courtyard. For this reason, it is called the Courtyard of the Cachette. The severely damaged Setest Pylon was constructed by Thutmose III. The two to the left living, and the dead to the right, the feet joined and arms crossed, holding a crook and a flail. The north face of the 8th pylon represents the king in action, with the gods and a procession of the sacred boat during the Opet festival. On the lower level, the wing contains a text of Hatshepsut, which gives homage to his father, as well as his confirmation as king. On the upper level, the sacred boat carried on the shoulders of priests led by the king in front of Amon. As he did for various monuments of his time, Thutmose III modified the set. Around 250,000 square meters, the Amon Temple enclosure is characterized by an extraordinary complexity and richness, which in architectural activity spans 2 millennia. Certain sections have not yet been excavated. It is impossible to establish a complete inventory of all the objects and buildings that make up the enclosure. There still remains many mysteries to be solved, many missions to carry out, which will write new pages in Egyptology, and even more will help to reinterpret the history of ancient Egypt.